I've come across a lot of media that talks about how a species of mold can design metros, potentially even better than humans can. These slime molds are simple organisms, but they form these complex-looking networks when searching for food. And once food is found, they optimize the networks to connect the food sources more efficiently by removing redundant paths. Here's a time-lapse that shows this. Metros could also be described as networks with similar goals as the mold. They're a series of paths designed to efficiently connect population centers instead of food. So researchers have placed molds on simplified models of cities where population centers are represented by food. And they've compared the networks created by the molds, which is shown on left, to the metro networks created by humans, which are shown on the right. Some results claim that both networks follow similar patterns, and even that the mold can produce more efficient networks than humans can. Of course, if you think about this for more than a moment, you'll realize that it's a big stretch to say that the mold accurately represents how metros are built. In the experiments, the mold doesn't care about geography, politics, the future, or really any practical limitations that come with building transport. But it does serve as an interesting way to think about the problem of creating efficient networks. The mold doesn't have a central brain which is calculating the best routes between food. Rather, it's relying on chemical processes to dictate where it grows and shrinks. Given that there's no intelligent brain controlling the movement, it's not too hard to try and make a simple computer program that models this behavior. So, I decided to make my own. Here is my model. The yellow squares are food sources, and the green square is the mold. The mold is attracted to the food sources. The strength of attraction is indicated by the length of these dark lines. Closer foods are more attractive, and since there's several foods, the mold moves towards a sum of all the attractions. There's also a bit of randomness added, which is the red line here. Now, these four connected lines can be simplified, and this simplified line shows us which direction the mold will move towards. I won't show the arrows for each movement, but the green square shows where the mold ends up. When it eventually reaches a food source, the mold pauses for a bit to eat, then continues to find new food sources. But this time, there's less arrows. This is because it's not attracted to food sources that have already been eaten. Darker squares indicate where the mold has traveled most recently, and it's possible for it to visit somewhere where it's already been. This example showed the mold moving in only one direction at a time, but the actual simulation will have many of these paths growing simultaneously. Once all the food sources have been eaten, the mold stops growing and the organism as a whole moves into the optimization stage. In this stage, the organism tries to find paths between food sources. Each food source will send out food that moves around randomly, ideally reaching another food source. If this happens, each square along the path increases in score. This path is shown by the orange line. After each food source has had its fair share of tries, the paths with the lowest scores are removed. This process continues, resulting in an iterative removal of the least efficient and redundant paths between food sources. Here's how this example ends up being optimized. The results don't look perfect, but that's just what this model produces. Now, let's look at a simulation with a lot more food. At this point, it stops growing and starts optimizing. During this stage, the lighter squares indicate the least used paths, which are most likely to be removed. The ideal point to stop optimizing is up to interpretation, but I'll stop it here while all the foods are still connected. Running two simulations with food in the same spots shows us how the resulting network can vary. Because there's some randomness in the model, there will be differences in how the organism both grows and optimizes. This is a good point to stop the two and compare the shape of the networks. Have a look at what differences you see. The research I mentioned earlier focused on how molds would create metro networks. So I made a simple model of Greater Vancouver's metro. Food sources were put at the rough geographic locations of existing metro stations, which have big population centers. This is how the simulation turned out. At this point, the network has finished optimizing. On the right, I've drawn a simplified version of it, and on the left is the simplified version of the real metro that was designed by humans. So, is the network that the mold designed better than the ones designed by humans? Well, there's a lot of ways you could describe what a good metro looks like. Let's look at a square of 4 stations as an example. What would be the best way to connect these stations? There could be direct lines between all of the stations. This ensures the shortest path between all points, but it would be expensive to build all these paths, and real metros generally don't look like this. A less expensive variant could be this cross. The paths between the stations are longer, but it looks more similar to a real metro. However, if we care about something like redundancy, this wouldn't be a good option. If any part of this metro breaks or needs maintenance, then there's no alternative ways to get between some stations. Here's another example. I'll let you consider what the upsides and downsides of this one would be, but even with just 4 stations, it's evident that the best network is dependent on what criteria you have. My model is just the result of passing food from one point to another without considering travel among the whole system. Whether it does well or not will depend on what expectations you have of it. Maybe it could create efficient networks, but I wouldn't guarantee it. So, what's the point of this model? Well, networks are hard to optimize, so even if there's a criteria that details exactly what an ideal network should achieve, once there are many points that need to be connected, it's not likely that a perfect solution is possible. However, the slime mold model serves as a simple way to generate an organic-looking network. Maybe this could be used as another tool in the problem-solving toolbox when considering networks. One upside is that you don't need a deep knowledge of graph theory to create the model. But the best part, in my opinion, is that it's just fun to watch.